Good morning. Welcome back to Part 2 of the Performance Management for Supervisors webinar. Thank you all for being here this morning. So let's get started. In Part 1 of this webinar, we discussed a couple of concepts that can enable us to be better leaders. Specifically, we talked about the steps for effective listening, and then I showed you a model you can use to assess whether an employee has a skill problem or a will problem, and then address it without building resentment, hopefully, by having a constructive, critical conversation. Hopefully you brought your memory of that with you, because we'll need it to move forward in talking about the concepts in this webinar. The overarching question is, how do we move toward a performance management system that enables our employees to be the best they can be? In this webinar, we'll explore that concept a little further by talking about situational leadership, recognition and reward, and some supervisory best practices. So here's a big screen full of misconceptions about performance management. You've probably heard some of these misconceptions before. You may even have said one or two of them yourself. I hope throughout the course of both the last webinar and this one to give you some insight into why these are, in fact, misconceptions. We as supervisors need to think of performance management as a year-round process that allows us to build relationships with our employees and help them be the best they can be in their current position while at the same time developing them for their next position. We'll spend the next hour or so talking about some tools for doing that. A key component of our jobs as supervisors is employee development. The situational leadership model I'm about to show you that will help us do that was developed by Blanchard and Hersey in the late 1960s. Some of you have probably seen this or something very similar to it before. The reason it's been around so long, though, is because it works. In order to lead effectively, you have to know three things: yourself, your people, and your mission or task. This model focuses on the last two of those, your mission and your people. And what it says is, for any given task, an employee will be at one of four developmental levels with regard to that task. The level the person's at depends on their competence to do the task, how well their KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities match up with the KSAs required, and also their commitment to it, how much value they perceive in doing it, how much motivation they have toward it. The most effective supervisors recognize what level the employee is and match them with their leadership style. The easiest way to think of this is with a new person. Conveniently, I happen to be a new person. I'm actually at my 5-month mark today, so I'm going to use myself as an example. When I first started at VDH, June 10, 2016, the day before, I had gone down to the Chesterfield Town Center and got myself some new clothes. I had driven my route, scoped out where I was going to park, and I was excited. It was my dream job. I was very interested in coming to work here and doing this job, and I was very excited about it. I didn't know anything about public health, didn't know anything about VDH, could barely spell VDH, but I was excited, I was committed, and I was happy to be here. So I was definitely a D1. I wanted to fit in, I wanted to do a good job. When I got here, they came down and got me. They brought me up to the 11th floor, showed me where my office was, where the refrigerator was, and boy, it was a good day. So one of the things that my supervisor did before I got here is he had our business manager set me up kind of a calendar for my first 3 weeks. Highly structured. Pretty much every minute of every day was planned out. I was reading policies. I was meeting the right people. I was going to staff meetings. Whatever it was that I needed to do to get up to speed, they made sure that I had that included into my calendar. So fast forward a few months, and the shine's off. Y'all know what I mean when I say the shine's off? Yeah, the honeymoon's over. So a few months in, I started to pick up some skills. I wasn't quite as clueless as I was when I first got here. I could at least consistently spell VDH, but I was starting to realize that all those mountains that I was going to move and all those barriers that I was going to get across and I was going to come here and do great things, I was starting to realize that some of those mountains are tall and big and heavy, and they've been there for many, many years, and there's a reason why they're there. So I was starting to get a little bit disillusioned with things. At this point, I had hit somebody in the parking garage. So it was not a good scene for me. My motivation was starting to lag a little bit. I got to thinking about my last job. I worked at the Virginia Department of Emergency Management out in Midlothian, It was lovely. I could pull right up to the building and park and roll right on in. Not like that here. So I kind of got to, I hit a lull here. And my boss, Micah Fairchild, some of y'all probably know him, senses that and adjusts his leadership style to be now more coaching. So he brings me in. We start having meetings. We start having conversations. Okay, I know these mountains are here. How are we going to get around them? Let's talk about it. So we spend a lot of time kind of meeting and brainstorming and coming up with ways to get around some of those mountains. Hopefully at some point, I fancy to think I might even get there before like this time next year. I'll hit the D3 mark, where I've got pretty good competence, so I know what I'm doing. I've learned who all those people are that I can work with. I've learned who the players are, what the mission is, the culture, how we support the mission. But at that point, maybe my competence is high, but my confidence is not so high. So that's where D3 comes in. And at that point, my leader is still going to bring me in. We're still going to have those conversations. We're still going to have those brainstorming strategy sessions. But now, instead of him making the decisions after we have the conversation, he's going to say, okay, Christy, I think you should make this decision, and I got your back. So eventually, hopefully, and this right here is supervisory mecca, y'all. If you get a bunch of people on your team at D4, you can tell them what you want done, and they will figure out how to get there. And it's a beautiful thing. So D4, high competence, high commitment. We give them the trust and authority to make their own decisions, give them the resources they need, and then get out of their way and let them decide how to get there. And it's a beautiful thing. In order to use this model effectively as a supervisor, the first thing you need to do is understand the situation you're trying to influence and the level of your followers. So you need to do some diagnosis. So what are some indicators of an employee's developmental level? How do you know where they are with regard to any particular task? Okay, when they've completed the task without or asking minimal questions, the types of questions they raise, record of past accomplishments, ability to complete tasks in the given time. Sure, those are some indicators. Whether they're self-motivated, yeah, so you kind of have to know who they are and who you're dealing with ahead of time. Like we said, know your employee. Okay, how they respond to new tasks in general. That's a really good point. Are they, again, that kind of gets to whether they're self-motivated, whether they're people that take initiative. They solve their own issues normally. Do they solve their own issues or do they come for help? Yeah, a lot of indicators there. And some others that you might consider, ask them. If you bring a new task to the table and you want an employee to start doing a new task, ask them how comfortable they are with it. How well do you feel your knowledge, skills, and abilities line up with the knowledge, skills, and abilities necessary to do this new task? You should probably have a pretty good indication or a pretty good idea of how they are just based on your day-to-day interaction. And Todd says, review their work, check in with them periodically. Yeah, absolutely, because you want to spend some time observing directly not only what they've done previous to this that might relate to it, but also when they start trying to do the new task. Another thing that I would suggest that you keep an eye on is their nonverbal cues, because like we talked about in the first webinar, one of the most important indicators, something that just don't lie, is body language. So if a person's saying verbally, yep, I got this, I'm all ready to go, and then you turn around and you see their shoulders slump and their head kind of starts wagging side to side, and they've got that body language like they're wondering, how in the world am I going to get this done? Well, then you know that their developmental level is probably not as high as what their verbal indicators told you. So you definitely want to watch that body language as well. So once you understand what developmental level they're at, then you need to adapt or adjust your behavior as a supervisor in response to what the follower needs. You'll need to interact with them in a manner they can understand and accept based on where they are developmentally. And finally, hopefully, advance them along the continuum toward D4, supervisory mecca. It's worth pointing out that there will be some followers who don't want to develop. There's going to be some people who are perfectly happy to spend their entire careers at D2, where they have some competence, probably more than they're willing to let on, but little to no commitment. I'm not even talking about D1, because at least D1 has a high level of commitment. These folks are at D2, and they're happy to be at D2, and they want to stay there for their entire careers. So what do we do with those people? Any thoughts on those career D2s? Okay. It's difficult to grow a program with those staffers. Yeah, if you've got a bunch of D2s, boy, it's tough. One of the things I suggest is that you try to find a way to see what motivates them. Try to find out what motivates them and apply that. Remind them about their EWP expectations sometimes. Serene says, even if you only have one. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, good. Cynthia, try to find what motivates them. Yep. It can feel like you don't have a lot of options. Yeah, I agree with that too. I will say one thing about D2 employees is if they are herding, kind of like cats, right? If they are doing the standard that is required by EWP, by Code of Conduct, by Standards of Conduct, and by Code of Ethics, there's not a whole lot you can do with them. I will grant you, I don't give up on those folks. I try to find, as Cynthia said, what motivates them. Try to find a way to reach them, try to help them understand that being part of the team is better than being lone wolf over here. But some people are, you're going to know what you're going to get from them, and it's going to be the minimum that is required. And to some extent, that's okay. They're a known quantity, right? You know what you're going to get from those folks is going to be what's in my EWP and nothing else. So for those people, I say hold them accountable to the standards of work and standards of behavior that are required, and know that they're a known quantity. You're going to get that out of them. It's going to be consistent. You're not going to probably get much else. So spend your time and energy toward development on those people who actually want to be developed. As far as the rest, if you have a person who is actively obscuring or blockading things that you're trying to do with your team, the one thing that I would suggest is that you consider your standards of conduct and your code of ethics in your application of when you have those critical conversations with those folks, consider those standards as something that you might use as kind of your ammunition to have those conversations with those folks. Because again, once they're meeting the minimum standards and they're not actively interfering with your team, not a whole lot you can do with them. But there are some things you can do to develop those people who want to be developed. So I want to look at a couple of examples here. And I'm going to give you a scenario, ask you to read that, and then I'm going to put up a poll and ask you all to vote on what developmental level you think Shanika is at. Okay, so I've put up the poll now. Okay, so most of y'all were right on top of this. Shanika is probably a D1. She is enthusiastic, she's a new employee, she's excited and committed, but she's going to need a lot of structure. She's brand new, first of all. She doesn't know anything about the culture and the organization that she's just joined. And she also is lacking some of the critical KSAs. And does that happen sometimes? This is rhetorical. Of course it happens sometimes. Unfortunately, our salaries sometimes are not as competitive as we might like. Some of our folks that we bring in are great people, but they may be lacking some of those knowledge, skills, and abilities, and we may need to work with them to develop those KSAs. So good job on that one. Absolutely, she's a D1. And we as the supervisor need to recognize that and give her all the structure she needs to be successful. Okay, we just talked about that. Let's do one more. Different example here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put up the poll. Okay, and most of y'all seized on that, the cues in the description. Let me take it off here. And you saw that the team is made up of senior leaders. They all have more than 5 years experience, and they all think that this is vital to continuing your district's continued superior performance. So you're seeing a high level of competence and a high level of commitment. Most of you chose either S3 or S4 corresponding to that. The one thing that I will tell you about this, I did see a couple of folks that didn't choose S3 or S4. It's a little bit of a trick question. If you think about, you probably have heard about the stages of team development, the forming, storming, norming, and then performing. Your answer on this one would probably depend on the stage that the group of formation, the stage of group formation this group is at. So when they first start and they're trying to get through those initial forming and storming phases, and everybody's kind of butting heads and trying to come to a consensus on what the direction is and how we're getting there from here, who's going to be our formal and informal leaders. During that those early stages of team development, you might want to have a little bit more structure, more of an S1 or S2 leadership style. As you get on into it, though, once they get on past that storming phase and they get into the norming and performing phase, when you have all the roles defined, everybody's kind of in agreement and moving toward the same direction, you can definitely back off at that point and take more of a supporting or delegating approach. The other thing that I want to point out about this model, this is, like I said, it's a situational leadership model. It's something that's been around for a long time. It's a simple concept, but it's a little harder to put into practice because people tend to shift between developmental levels, not only based on what task you're asking them to do, but also kind of what's going on in their external lives and in their work lives as well. Stress, for example, causes a person to sometimes tend to regress. If something's going on external to work that's causing a person to not be able to focus their full attention on their work, you might see them move from a D4 down to a D2. So you need to kind of be aware that this model is great, but it's not the end-all, be-all. I could tell you a story about something that happened when I was in the Navy where I had a guy that went from D4 to D1 in the space of about 10 minutes. But that's for another time. We'll catch that. If you catch me in the elevator here in the Madison building, I'll tell you that one. But just know that if you've got external factors coming in and complicating things, or if you put a new skill on somebody, for example, if someone is a D4 employee and they're just busting their tail and they're working it and you rarely even have to speak with them because they know what they're doing and they're actually leading other people in doing the right thing, that's wonderful. But what happens when you make that person a supervisor? You've just introduced a brand new set of skills onto that person. You can't expect them to go from being a D4 employee to being a D4 supervisor. It's a brand new set of skills. So you need to be aware that they're probably going to regress back toward D1, and you're going to need to adjust your leadership style in that skill set to help them move along that continuum again. That's definitely a down and dirty version of that. This is something we could probably spend a half day talking about, just this alone. But that's the gist of it. So if you think of questions as we go along, just feel free to type them in the chat window. But I'm going to move along seeing no questions at this time. I want to talk a little bit about recognition and reward. So if we think of performance management as a system, this is kind of what it looks like. This is straight out of the mind of Michelle Johnson. Michelle is the most brilliant graphic designer in the world. But this is kind of what it looks like. There are many components that feed into effective performance management, and we'll talk more in depth about each of these coming up. A little levity for you first. But that leads me to this, that regular feedback is critical to performance management. It takes many forms. One of the most important of these is regular meetings. Meetings allow the supervisor to set the tone for the work environment, keep employees informed, take and receive feedback, and set expectations. They're also important to maintaining a sense of continuity and camaraderie within your work groups. You may think people know what their jobs are and don't need regular interaction with other team members and or their supervisor, but it's a scientific fact that people perform better when they're part of a team. What you have to be careful about, though, is meeting fatigue. A good rule of thumb is to schedule meetings as a regular touch tone at the frequency where you have enough to talk about to fill 1 hour or less. One-on-one meetings are a good idea if you have a limited number of direct reports. At the very least, you should have an open door policy or some mechanism by which your employees can get access to you when needed. You should always address performance management issues and negative changes in work behavior as they arise. We talked about in the first webinar that conflict is not something that we enjoy, obviously, but letting things fester, letting things go unaddressed, it really does put a negative crimp on your team. I'll spend just a couple minutes talking about geographically dispersed work teams, because this presents its own set of challenges, and I know some of y'all are dealing with that out there. So to ensure our geographically dispersed work teams still feel like part of the team, it takes an extra layer of effort. So y'all tell me, what are some strategies you're using to keep those geographically dispersed teams together? Okay, yeah, rotate meetings between locations. All right, hold webinars, video conference meetings, yep. Technology, thank God for the conference call. Frequent contact, yeah, include them in staff meeting via teleconference. Periodic central meetings, so getting everybody in the same room at the same time. Just a couple of suggestions that I have. I strongly recommend that you as the supervisor try to spend at least one day a quarter with each member of your dispersed work team. Just get a VPN token, plan on working from a remote location, arrange it ahead of time, make sure your employee knows you're coming, so you can talk about any issues, and hopefully spend a little time kind of observing what's going on there, seeing their unique challenges, seeing what their work environment is like, making sure that you know that you care, they know that you care about them, and that you care about them enough to come out and see them and spend time with them. Something else we talked about, you all pointed out very nicely, have your entire team get together for team building. Central Virginia Health District just recently did a staff development day. One of the games they played was a Facts About CVHD Jeopardy game, and it helped people who didn't normally work together to spend some time getting to know their coworkers. And of course, you all mentioned several technology solutions, phone conversations, webinars, Polycom, Skype, but there really is no substitute for face-to-face interaction, so you really have to make a point for advocating for that regularly. Can't say enough about that. All right, let's talk about documentation. A well-maintained supervisor's file is indispensable to performance management. Not only does it help when it comes time to reward an employee for a job well done, but it also adds credibility to the progressive consequences we talked about during the first webinar. The supervisor's file is really your on-hand account of how an employee is doing. Because it contains sensitive information, it must be stored in a safe, locked drawer. You should never leave information about an employee's performance, disciplinary action, or even recognition out for anyone to see. What types of documents should be in the supervisor's file? Okay, counseling memos, if you have that informal counseling or formal counseling. Unofficial conversations and coaching. Notes from meetings you've had. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, performance evals, good. Notes, yep. Things you've discussed with them, absolutely. Good feedback, absolutely. Yeah, not just the bad stuff, but when you get good feedback about an employee, say you get an email from someone about something they did for another office or district, or feedback from a customer, print that out and put it in their supervisor file. I always like to keep the current EWP. I like to keep past and current performance evaluations. Accomplishments and problems encountered, Jane says. Absolutely. Let's see if I've got anything else. If there is an acknowledgement of extraordinary contribution or a notice of improvement needed or a performance improvement plan, any of that, of course, we want to keep a copy of that in the supervisor's file as well. So the supervisor's file is really a pretty valuable tool, but sometimes we forget to take the time to keep that thing up to date, but it really can help us a lot when it comes time to do performance management. All right, so to be effective, the performance management system can't be based on one-way communication. Without feedback from the employee, the supervisor probably won't be able to accurately assess the employee's work style, feedback preferences, or developmental level. The other reason employee feedback is so important is because we as supervisors need to be open to hearing what we can do better to support our employees. Remember, this is about building relationships. Without feedback on what we can do better, we're missing half the equation. We just finished the annual evaluation process, so I'm not going to go too far in depth, but there are a couple of highlights I want to cover. Hopefully you did a little better than Dilbert's boss. Talk a little bit about the annual evaluation process. A key component in making the annual evaluation process something of value for both the employee and supervisor is employee feedback. Self-assessment. It's important for a lot of different reasons. Filling gaps of things the employee's done during the year that we may not know about. That supervisor's file is pretty indispensable, but we may not always know when an employee has done something they consider noteworthy, especially if you have 15 employees reporting to you and they're geographically dispersed. It's really hard to know what each of those people are accomplishing every day. Also let us know what accomplishments the employee considers important. They let us assess how self-aware our employees are and help us understand our employees' work and career goals. So I strongly encourage you to do what you have to do to get that input. The one thing that I want to kind of drive home is, although we encourage our employees to submit their self-assessments on the evaluation form, that is not by any means a necessity. If you can get the feedback in an email, if you can get it in response to a couple of questions, if you can get it verbally, get the feedback. That's the really important part, because that tells us all those things we just talked about that self-assessment. Self-assessment time is also an opportunity for the employee to provide input into their EDP, their Employee Development Plan. The EDP is an important guide for the development steps that the employee wants or needs to take for the following year. This is one of the times when the EWP should be reviewed for any updates or changes as part of the process. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. But reviewing the EWP, that's something we should be doing right now as they're due at the end of this month. The performance planning meeting, very important part of the annual evaluation process and in furthering the credibility of your performance management system. As a supervisor, you want to make sure you're thoroughly prepared ahead of time. Ensure you have a copy of the employee development plan and the evaluation at a minimum. You'll want to make sure you schedule a private location, uninterrupted time. When you have your discussion about the employee's performance, I encourage you to make that a two-way conversation. Give feedback on the employee's performance and ask him or her to give you feedback on yours. Ask how you can make the job easier, the work environment better. Ask about the employee's goals and make sure the EDP reflects the discussion. Speaking of the EDP, it's another key component of effective performance management. It should provide concrete, actionable steps to help the employee improve any areas identified during the assessment of performance that occurred with the annual evaluation. So if you got some areas, and everybody has them, I guarantee you, if you're not spending time identifying these for your employees, then we're really not doing as much of our job as we think we are. Everybody's got something they could do better. Even if they walk on water, they're a D4 all the time, everybody's got something they can do better. So the EDP is where we help brainstorm with the employee and find ways to improve those areas. If you've had those skill versus will conversations during the year, now's the time to assess any unmet skill needs. Emerging KSAs or competencies. As the world changes around us, so must we to be able to meet those challenges. You also want to take into account both your work unit's business needs and the employee's career goals. Are there stretch assignments or cross-training opportunities that make sense? And then we used to say in the military that you get what you inspect, not what you expect. So don't forget to pull the EDP out periodically during the year and talk about how the employee is doing in relation to it. Standards. Standards provide us the yardstick by which we can measure an employee's performance. Okay, Jareen says define stretch assignment. So if someone is a regular boots-on-the-ground employee and they want to develop their leadership potential, maybe we give them an assignment to a committee and ask them to be in charge of that committee. So it's a little bit of a stretch for them. It's not something they normally would do, but it allows them to develop in a way that they want to develop, or a skill that they want to develop. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you. So standards. Let's talk about some standards. What are we talking about when we say standards in performance management? Okay, benchmarks, yeah. Expectations explained, yep. Think about policy and/or, there you go, performing tasks in EWP. So the EWP is a big one. What other standards do we need to hold our folks accountable to when we're talking about performance management? And ourselves as well. Good, code of ethics, absolutely. Something that's applicable across the board. Standards of conduct, another one that's applicable across the board. Absolutely. Some others might be DHRM policy 1.60, which is standards of conduct, which you guys already covered. Code of ethics is 1.03, just in case you wanted some light reading. BDH policy 1.03. Standards of care, any local code of ethics or mission or vision statement. But I'll tell you, the employee work profile is especially important because it's really the basis for a large part of performance management. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about those. This is not a class in writing EWPs, but I want to talk about them because they are an important part of regular performance management and they are important to your employee's success. So we'll focus on the review that should occur as part of the regular performance management cycle. A well-written EWP should provide an accurate standard to measure the employee's performance. It is very difficult to write a good, solid, valid performance evaluation if the EWP that you're writing it against is not an accurate reflection of what that person's been doing all year. So I encourage you to make sure that it is an accurate reflection of what the person does. If they're not a solid reflection of what the position does day to day, they either need to be rewritten or the position needs to be reclassified. They should be written at entry-level, contributor level for the position, not the individual. So even if an individual has like mad skills in a certain area, we're not going to rewrite the EWP just to kind of gerrymander around that person's mad skills. It's got to be written for the position, because eventually that superstar is going to leave, and then you've got an EWP that's no longer an accurate reflection of your business needs. So make sure it's written for the position, not the individual. Of course, they should be reviewed regularly and changed when needed. They should also show how the position supports the work unit and agency mission. And of course, as you're reviewing them, they need to change to reflect the changing nature of public health. You think about what's going on in the world today. The world is getting very complicated around us. Population health, public health, all those buzzwords, global interdependencies, aging infrastructure, demographic shifts, all these things that are happening around us have a tendency to affect our missions, our business needs, and in turn, of course, they better affect our EWPs of our folks that are performing those tasks. If the standards by which we perform our jobs aren't also changing, we're falling further and further behind. So again, please make that EWP review a part of your regular evaluation process. It's pretty darn important. I'm going to shift gears now and talk just a little bit about employee recognition. When I first got to VDH, on day 3 of week 2, and I read the discretionary spending policy because that's when it was on my calendar, I went into a dark state of depression. I wept at my desk because it is draconian, and it is, in my opinion, pretty terrible. Sometimes in this era of budget crises, hiring freezes, discretionary spending policies, we kind of feel like we got 1.5 hands tied behind our backs when it comes to recognizing our employees. So I just want to talk about this for a few minutes, and I want to hear your creative solutions for things that you do to recognize your employees. There are a lot of ways we can still do it, so let's talk about some of them. Y'all give it to me. Okay? Jane takes them out to lunch. I know you probably pay for that out of your own pocket. Bless your heart. But that's a wonderful way. Feeding somebody is always a good thing. Yeah. Personalized thank you notes or emails. Yeah, absolutely. I've always found the handwritten is a nice way. Nice notes, little candies, compliments, food. Yep. Potluck lunch to recognize accomplishments. Okay, good. Yeah, I love that. My supervisor ordered warm cookies. I want your supervisor. Don't tell Micah. All right, praise them in front of others. Absolutely. You've probably heard praise in public, discipline in private, so you want to make sure you follow that. Give them credit for what they did in a group setting. Good. Okay, Alicia from Crater has a recognition and B attitude program awarded and recognized at the general staff meetings. Okay, good. Recognition leave has come up. And you all know that the guidance on that is 4 hours per FTE. Yeah, and Cynthia, very good point. You need to know what that individual likes in terms of recognition, because some of the things that work for one employee may not work for another employee. So really good suggestions. Anything else you can think of? The golden peach. Okay, we're going to talk about that later, Alicia. I'm going to call you. Highlight board, good. Identifying accomplishments from different team members on a bulletin board. I like that because that puts it up in a public sphere and lets everybody see this person's done well. One of the things that I did, I started doing it in the military, and I carried it with me when I left the military and went to the state, is I will actually send a letter to a person's house. I'll get their address. I'll get their permission. I don't like go stalk them and follow them home or anything. I'll get their permission. I've never had anybody say no. So I ask them for their address, and then I'll send a letter to their spouse, significant other, children, whatever it is, and I'll just tell them kind of in civilian terms, in layman's terms, this is why your husband, wife, mother, father, whatever it is valuable to our team. This is what they do every day. This is what's so important about what they do. Saying thank you. Yeah, great one, Tiffany. Thank you goes a long way. I know it doesn't go all that far because it certainly doesn't put more money in anybody's pocket, but it does go a long way. Just knowing that someone is paying attention to what you're doing and cares about it, that goes a long way. Something else that you might consider is letting people be in charge of their own destiny to some extent. So, for example, if you're doing a staff development day, letting your staff be the ones that plan the agenda, decide what it is that they want to do. Give them some guidance so that it's going to be something that's going to be worthwhile for everybody, but at the same time, let them take ownership of that. Something else that may not be thought of as recognition, but I think it is training. So if you're going to invest in a person and send them to a day-long training or a 2-day-long training, that to me is an investment. That's a recognition saying, I recognize that you're worthy of investment, and I'm going to send you to this training. So a lot of different ways to do it. I'm just going to go down my list here and just make sure we hit all these. Stretch assignments, like we talked about earlier, that's another. And again, that's important to know your person, because where one person might see a stretch assignment as a reward, somebody else may see it as more work and a punishment. So you got to know if your person is going to respond to that. Food is always good. Having fun at work, making work in a fun environment. We just recently did a Halloween dress-up here in the Office of Human Resources. That's kind of a fun, no-cost way to recognize folks as well. Because this is tough. This is one that gets right down to my heart, because it breaks me down, that discretionary spending policy. Okay. I want to share with y'all a few best practices based on my experience, and this is by no means all-inclusive. It's by no means the best thing that, it's just sliced bread. I don't profess to know it all. I don't profess to know a whole lot. But I will tell you, as I've said in the first webinar, I have had an opportunity to practice leadership in a lot of different scenarios and a lot of different places, and I've learned a lot of lessons from that. And I've been fortunate to have great leaders who have taught me when I've messed up, which is a lot. One thing Tammy just brought out, ask the employee how they would like to be recognized. Yeah, absolutely. Spend some time talking with them. Get to know them, get to know what works for them. So let's go through a couple of these best practices. First thing, like I've said a couple of times in these past couple of webinars, it's all about relationships. You will live or die by how good your relationships are. Doesn't mean you have to be best friends with the person, with your work team, but having relationships built on trust and mutual respect and consistency from you as a supervisor will always make a better work atmosphere. It takes time, it takes patience, it takes a steady hand. You have to show yourself trustworthy every day through your actions, through treating your employees with respect, listening to them, valuing their contributions, and through developing them and having their backs. Okay? Good point, Cynthia. A great book called The 5 Languages of Appreciation in the Workplace. A lot like The 5 Languages of Love, I imagine. Very good recommendation. Thank you. So the next one is know that you, supervisor, are the agency to your workers. When an employee goes home and talks about his or her job to the family and tells that spouse or significant other how their day was, you are the first line of what represents the person's experience at the agency. A large percentage of that story is going to be about their interactions with you. There are some things that we absolutely cannot control. We cannot control that there's a hiring freeze. We cannot control that there's a budget crisis. We cannot control that there's a discretionary spending policy. But we can control a lot of things about what our employees' experience is day to day in the workplace. Are they valued? Do we listen to them? Do we bring their opinions into bear when we can? All those things, that's us. That's supervisors. Get to know your employees. Of course, you want to know them. You want to let them know you. Understand their work styles, the way they prefer feedback and reward, a lot of things we've talked about during the course of this webinar. Their strengths and weaknesses, their developmental levels with respect to the tasks that you're asking them to do. Conversely, you need to let them know you as a leader, what your leadership and communication styles are, how they can help you help them, all those things. I love mission statements. It's because I was in the military, so I'm going to recommend this to you. Consider developing a work unit and or personal mission statement. The reason I love them is because it gives us a yardstick by which we can measure whether we should or shouldn't do something. Helps us focus our efforts. I have a personal mission statement, and it's the first thing I see on my whiteboard every morning as I'm logging into my computer. Mine is very simple. It's 3 words. Make it better. I want to make the agency better by doing a good job and making a positive difference. I want to make my employees better by developing them. In fact, I have only one employee right now, so I should say I want to make my employee better by developing her. And I want to make myself better by challenging myself to learn new skills, push my boundaries, get new information. Develop your staff. You should be training your replacement. Sometimes this is through formal training, and sometimes often not. A lot of things you can do here. Bring your employees into the decision-making process. Provide feedback, not only positive, but also not so positive when they need to work on something or don't do something up to the standard that you feel like they can do. Let them know that. Mentor. Show them their mistakes. Take the time. This goes a long way toward building that relationship we talked about earlier. It's not just about saying yes all the time. It's about sometimes saying no, or sometimes saying, here, let me show you how we can do that better. Lead by example. Lord have mercy. Own your boss's decision as if they are your own. Now, this is hard sometimes when that decision is unpopular. But if you can do it, it increases your credibility and builds respect. Throwing your boss under the bus when he or she makes an unpopular decision may feel good, but if you give in to that temptation, that sets up the expectation that that kind of behavior is okay. Take the high road, take responsibility. It'll pay dividends for you. Of course, you want to practice all those good communication skills we've talked about over these 2 webinars. Make sure you're taking the time to show your employees you value their input and your relationship with them. Actively listen, engage with good conversation, good questions that can help you get to the root causes of any issues. Addressing performance management issues head on. It may be tough at the beginning. A lot of people don't like conflict, but addressing them directly using some of the skills we've looked at in these webinars builds a respectful workplace and ensures your employees understand their incentives for doing the right things and consequences when they don't do the right things. What best practices would you all add? Okay. Doreen just gave us one via private. Okay. And I'll rephrase that for the public. Be positive about your employees and about your team. Never miss an opportunity to say thank you. I like that one. Doesn't cost anything. It's easy to do, and it goes a long way. I agree. The big one for me is having a sense of humor. You know, make light, make work be a fun place if you can. I don't like to make jokes at the expense of anyone else, but I've always found that self-deprecating humor or joking bureaucracy, it always works. Any other thoughts on best practices? I know I got some good supervisors out there, so y'all give me something here. Okay. Joanne says keep employees motivated. How do you do that, Joanne? Okay. Try to understand what they enjoy working on, and to the extent you can, probably adjust their assignments. Okay. Let the team know that it is a team, absolutely, and where each person fits into that. Okay. Sometimes, Alicia, that's not necessarily terrible. Comparing to other places that don't have it like we do, work hours, yeah. Flexible work hours where you can sometimes. Okay, good. Jane, always ask what I can do to make their job easier. Yep. Be pleasant to them. They notice. Absolutely. I like this one that Daniel came out too. Don't give assignments that you wouldn't want to handle yourself. And I would even suggest that to the extent you can, you might consider jumping in and helping out with your employees or doing one of the tasks or asking them to show you how to do one of the tasks that they're doing. You're not going to be as fast at it or as good at it as they are, but just simply wanting to learn what they do and wanting to understand how to do it and being able to jump in a pinch is always good. One of the first things I did as an engineering officer on board my first ship is I went down and crawled around in the bilges, the nastiest part of the ship, and traced out systems and learned all the systems that my folks were working on because I didn't want them to think that I was above learning what they did. And it paid dividends for me. I was much more knowledgeable for that. I certainly wouldn't want to be the one turning the wrench, but I'll at least know where the wrench is. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, good. Being an honest, humble supervisor, yeah. Proper tools, training, and resources to meet job duties. Yep, like that too. Very good. Yep, being sincere. Yeah, that people can spot a liar or a phony from a mile away. And humble. It's always good. Okay. Man, Cynthia, I want to come work with y'all. Bake cake and cookies. That's great. Yeah, I think celebrate accomplishments, celebrate milestones for people. You want to make sure that people understand that they're appreciated and their contributions are appreciated. So awesome. I think that you all have a good handle on it. This is great. Work toward their strengths, celebrate successes, and learn from mistakes. Yeah, absolutely. All strong habits. Team building. Good. Yep. If you can get that team to be a cohesive unit, boy, that goes a long way. So I want to thank you all for your time and participation over the course of the 2 webinars. Very, very helpful to have you all come in and talk from your own experience and spend some time interacting. I know this is not the most interactive platform that we could use for a training like this, but as I've said, this is kind of what we got at this point. but be aware that this is kind of the first of many. We're going to talk a lot more about these types of topics and spend a lot of time doing these types of conversations, not only via this format, but hopefully, if I have my way, it'll be a lot more face-to-face conversations as well. If you have questions in the meantime, please feel free to contact me directly. You have my phone number there. I'm in the global address list. And once we leave here, please take the time to fill out the post-course survey and just let us know how we can improve in the future. Very much appreciate you all for coming to this webinar, and I very much appreciate the leadership you provide your employees every day. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.